I like to watch the Nowman Show because it is better than the best show on all of TV.
The wind will change, the water main will break, risks happen, and so you got to kind of always be trying to get more surplus, more profits, because the more you have, the safer you are to face any eventuality. It's built into the system that the capitalist's anxiety about keeping his or her hands on that surplus means you got to use the surplus to build your company to get more surplus and therefore become safer. And so the system has built into it not just the need to get as much surplus as possible, but to grow the enterprise, to build it out. Because if you don't, you risk collapse, disaster.
Hello, this is Niswander, and you're watching The Nowman Show. And today I'm here with David Bowie's piano man, Mike Garson. Hello, it's great to see you again.
Likewise.
This is fantastic. So a lot has happened, actually, since we were last in this room together. The David Bowie celebration concert I attended at the Wiltern.
Sting was kind of a wild highlight both nights. He was supposed to come just one night. He liked it so much he came back. And he sang, I think, Lazarus, right?
And he did Black Star.
Anyone who has the real jazz sensibility tends to like to create in the moment.
And you are obviously a medical doctor. What is the best way going forward to get a single payer in this country? Most countries have that, and we need it too.
Exactly. We need it, and we can afford it, in fact, because it doesn't cost any more than what we are paying right now. It simply ensures that our healthcare dollars are paying for healthcare, not for health profiteering. We need a healthcare system that is established for people, not for making profit. So again, this is all a matter of achieving critical mass. We need to come together as the many movements we are for health justice, for climate justice, for racial and economic and LGBT justice, and women's justice. When we get together with the courage of our convictions, we're unstoppable.
I'm Dan Nowman Niswander. Great speakers open their hearts and open their minds before they open their mouths. Richard Wolff is an economist. He's a visiting professor in the graduate program in International Affairs of the New School University in Manhattan. He's also professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. He's the author of books such as Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. He has a regular column in truthout.org, and he's the host of the radio program Economic Update. He spoke at the Musicians Union in Hollywood on the subject of economic crisis and system decline and what we can do. Ladies and gentlemen, scholars and students, Professor Richard Wolff.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for coming. I have been a critic of capitalism in ways you're about to tour with me for many, many years. And for most of that time, nothing remotely like what's happening now ever happened before. And that includes the 1960s, when I was a student. Something very, very profound is changing in the United States, where voices like mine are drawing audiences like this. I'd love to think, for my own ego gratification, that it's me, but I know it isn't. Because it is the same song that I've been singing. I update it, I jazz it up a bit, but it's the same song. So the reason there are all these people is the change is in you. The change is in the society. Suddenly, all of this stuff is urgently important to people. It's absolutely remarkable to me, and I want you to share, as I do, an enormous sense of power and potential The attention in the society may go to the Tea Party, but the changes that I've experienced traveling across the country, as I do a lot now, is one event like this after another. And when that goes on for a year or two, as it has, you know something very big is happening. So I think before we even begin the tour of what's amiss with capitalism and where we stand today, you should stop and enjoy, as I do, the enormous sense that we are at a turning point and that the people of the United States are going to surprise an awful lot of folks, both here and abroad, with the shift and the change that is now well underway, and of which Occupy was just one momentary explosion, and there will be others with the same or other names, because the movement in that direction now is too big, involves too many people across too many states to be considered anything other than epoch-making kind of change. Okay. I want to ask you to go with me through a little bit of history about this system, this capitalist system of ours. Been around for a while. I want you to go with me to understand how it grew, why it was successful, why it hit a major turning point in the 1970s, and why it puts us in such a bad situation now. And when we're done, I'm going to try to present to you a way forward, a way out of this mess, a solution, just for you to think about, to consider. It's the best solution I could find, and I've spent a long time looking. And I think you might find it interesting to think about. Well, to talk about capitalism is no easy matter. It's a big thing. That's why it has that ism at the end. That's when you know something is important, because it's an ism. The trouble is, different people see it in different ways. So I'm going to tell you how I go about it. For me, the key institution I want to understand is the institution with and in which human beings produce the goods and services without which we cannot survive. The food, the clothing, the shelter, the transportation, the typewriter, the hamburger, the haircut, all of it. And that institution in modern capitalism is the enterprise, the corporation, the business, whatever you want to call it. I think that's a good way to understand capitalism. Capitalism is a peculiar way of organizing enterprises. It's different from the 1,000 years before capitalism, when people organized an enterprise differently. In Europe, they organized something called a feudal manor, a landlord, serfs, all kinds of stuff like that, that we don't have time for today. We don't do that in capitalism. We organize capitalism, the enterprises of capitalism, in a very peculiar way that it pays to understand. The majority of people in every corporation, big and small, are people who come to work 9 to 5, more or less, 5 days a week, and work. They produce some good, they produce some service. And for doing that, they get paid. I'm just going to use a simple number, let's say $20 an hour. They get paid. Let's take a look at that. If you sit down with an employer and you dicker over the details and you finally agree on $20 an hour, you all know something, but perhaps you've never put it in these words before. Here's what you know. That the employer would never pay you $20 an hour unless the following fact were true. That in that hour, your work, your brains and your muscles would produce more than $20 worth of stuff for your employer to sell. Because if it didn't, there'd be no sense in hiring you for $20. In other words, the condition of employment in capitalism, in a capitalist enterprise, whether it's McDonald's hamburgers or McDonnell Douglas aircraft, The condition is the worker must always produce more than he or she gets. Now, I know this is troubling if you actually heard what I just said. Many of you would like to make the following sentence true. I will never work for anyone who doesn't pay me what I'm worth. The problem for you all your life will be, no one will ever do that. That you live in an economic system that says to you, we are always going to get more out of you than we give you. Because if we can't, we're not going to give you anything. Wow. That means that for those of you at the end of a hard working day, have that sinking, sad feeling, I feel as though I just got ripped off. That's right, you did. No wonder in that hour or two after work, you need to go to a place which has on the outside of the window, happy hour. You ever wonder why they call it happy hour? Do you ever allow yourself to think what that says about all the hours before that? The workplace, the capitalist workplace, is one of the most profoundly undemocratic institutions on the face of the earth, and always has been. You live with the consequences on your job of the board of directors' decisions. You have no power whatsoever over them. Democracy means you participate in the decisions that affect your life. We elect political leaders because they make decisions that affect us, and so we make them responsible, at least in theory, to us, because we live with the results. But of course you live with the results of your employer's decisions, but you have no power over them. And if that has never occurred to you before, think about what that means. You live that experience. The workplace is where adults spend most of their lives. 5 out of 7 days, you go to work. You get up in the morning, brush your teeth, listen to bad news programs, and get ready to go to work. Then you work for 8 hours, except, of course, if you listen to KPFK, of course. Then you work 8 hours. Then you go home and you recoup so you can do that again the next day. This is where you spend your life. If you gave a damn about democracy, that would be the first institution in which you would install it. But we live in a society that has exempted the workplace from that. Wow. What does it mean that a society goes to war in Iraq and Afghanistan to bring democracy? What are you talking about? What idea is this? You want to bring them the benefits of working in an institution where they have absolutely no participation in reaching all of the basic decisions upon which their lives depend. You're not bringing them democracy. You're bringing the American capitalist system. It's not democratic, and it never was.
Hello, this is Niswander of the Nowman Show, and I'm here at Occidental College with Professor Richard Wolff of New School University in Manhattan. Thank you for being on the Nowman Show, Professor.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I have a couple questions for you. First of all, we just heard a great talk called Imagining Alternatives and Progressive Economics and Social Movements. First of all, what is the history of socialism in the United States?
The history of socialism in this country is not so different from the history elsewhere. Basically, since capitalism arose as a system and it came to the United States with the colonists who took over this country from the Native Americans, capitalism has been the way that the system organized itself, employers and employees. And like all systems, capitalism in the United States and elsewhere has had the people who love it and the people who don't, the people who think it's a great achievement and the people who think we can and should do better. The folks who think we can and should do better, over time, adopted a name for themselves, and the name was socialists. Their idea was capitalism is a system set up for a minority of people, the few who own the factories, the offices, the stores, who are in a position to decide what gets produced and what gets done with the profits. And they run the system to benefit themselves. And the critics said, yeah, but that's the problem. The system benefits you because you run it, but we, who are the majority, and in whose name a revolution in America against Britain was run, we are being left out. So we want the whole society to benefit, not just you, and so they took the name socialists. They did it in Europe, they did it here. And so the irony of it is that socialism is capitalism's shadow. You can't get rid of your shadow, and capitalism can never get rid of socialism, because socialism is the name for the people who are critics. And you can imagine that the system will one day be so wonderful that it will have no critics. But that's never happened in the history of the human race, and it's really a long shot this time. So socialists have been up and down. They've been big, with lots of people thinking it. Other times they've been small. What you can say is the idea that you could get beyond it, that you could live in a capitalism that had no socialism, that's we've never seen. And the irony of ironies is that now, after a Cold War period since Second World War, when it was almost taboo to say socialism, here it comes once again, proving itself always there as it comes roaring back, first in the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, and now in the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, as if to tell the world, I told you so, socialism isn't going away, you haven't erased it, because it's the shadow, it's the criticism. And eventually, my guess is that the critics will so outnumber the defenders that the system will dissolve. Because I think that's what happened in the Soviet Union in 1989, that the critics were so numerous, were so determined, that it just fell apart. It was a dissolution, and the notion that it can only happen there and can't happen here is the worst kind of wishful thinking.
And we have, as you mentioned, capitalists dominating the system, essentially. So it's not the ism, it's the people behind it dominating the system. So how do capitalists who've been set in their ways now, we're not just talking about a couple generations, we're talking, 200 some years. How would capitalists evolve into this new system?
Well, my guess is they wouldn't evolve. That is, some would find this perfectly reasonable. I actually know of quite a few cases in the United States over the last 20 years when capitalists who built up a very successful business came to the end of their lives, and their children weren't interested in carrying on this business. So they didn't know what to do. They could close the business, but they didn't want to do that because it's a lifetime's work. They built up this business, they have their employees, they care about them, they're decent people. So they didn't want to close the business, and they didn't want to sell it to some faceless monster corporation, because who knows what they will do with the business and the property. So they didn't know what to do, and then we came along and we said, there is another solution. You could sell it to the workers, convert it into a collective activity of these working people. It's a new way of doing business, but it keeps their jobs, it keeps their communities. It is an exciting new way to live your life, your work life. Why don't you give it a shot? And I think that you'll be surprised that there is a significant number of capitalists who will find their way to this, not as something imposed on them, but something that they choose. But I see your point. There will be capitalists who hate it, who want to block it, who want to stop it. But let me go back to the example of the Soviet Union. Most people agree that in the decades before the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had a powerful central government with an elaborate secret police, with an elaborate system of controlling the population. Most Americans thought it was a dictatorship of one kind or another. They were tough, they could control the opposition. Yeah, and then they couldn't. then despite all of their apparatus and all their secret police, the existing regime fell apart. The Soviet Union came to an end. I understand that there are powerful forces in the capitalist sector, in the government, that would want to stop this. But the fact that they have a lot of resources and the fact that they want to stop it is no more a guarantee that they'll be able to do that than it proved to be for the people who ran the Soviet Union. So I think we ought to take our hats off for a minute and understand every economic system in the history of the world has been born, has developed, and then has passed away. Capitalism was born in England in the 18th century, 17th century, has spread all over the world, changed in the process. It's now everywhere, but the question is it now passing away? The notion that capitalism, unlike any other system, will live forever and not pass away, I think the burden of that, proof of that, is on the people who believe it, not those of us who find it unbelievable.
Well, you mentioned in your talk about even Plato and Aristotle that did not like markets, and markets is what capitalism is really all about, correct?
I've been teaching a course. I taught it at Yale. I taught it at the University of Massachusetts. I've taught it in New York. It's called The History of Economics Thought. It's one of the standard courses that students in economics are required to take, so they get a sense of how their discipline developed. And I always begin the course by assigning readings from Plato and Aristotle, just to show, A, that they had very good questions they asked about economics, good answers that they gave, and I must admit I want them to see that both Plato and Aristotle thought markets were a terrible institution because they set everybody against everybody else. Everybody is always trying to give as little as possible to get in exchange as much as possible. This puts you in an adversarial, ugly relationship with everybody. How are you going to have friendships? How are you going to have love relationships when they're always undercut and contradicted by the economic way you do your transactions that make your life better? And another thing both Plato and Aristotle hated was that markets tend to favor those who have money. I mean, that's what a market is. The more money you have, the more you get. If there's scarce items, the one with more money offers to pay more, which the one with less can't afford. So what markets do is they pander to the rich. And in the minds of Plato and Aristotle, this is not a good arrangement for social cohesion, for community solidarity, because this favoritism will develop a polarity between rich and poor, and that is dynamite dangerous for a community to allow that to go on. And boy, do we live in a capitalism today which has let that process go on farther than has been done for a long time, and it's equally scary to people now on all sides of the political divide, because there's this deep sense that this level of inequality is social dynamite.
And with Oxfam statistics, 62 billionaires on the planet have as much wealth as half the lower half of the population. So, Professor Wolff, thank you so much for being on the Nowman Show. Give us some information of where people can learn more about what you're doing.
Yeah, if you like the materials that we do, the radio program Economic Update that we do, then please visit our websites. They're open 24/7, no charge whatsoever. The two of them are rdwolff with 2 Fs.com, that's me, and the other one is called Democracy at Work, all one word, democracyatwork.info, I-N-F-O.
Fantastic. Professor Wolff, thank you very much for being on the Nowman Show.
Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. This is Niswander.
So let's begin with the collapse of Eastern Europe's socialist experiment. 1989, 1990, then. If you recall, that amazing disintegration came for most of the security services around the world, and certainly for ours in this country, as a complete and utter shock and surprise. Those geniuses hadn't seen it coming. That's something you should keep in mind. These kinds of collapses take a long time to build up, and then they happen suddenly, but it isn't sudden at all. It's something that could have and should have been seen, and when you go back, you can pretty well put it together. And if it happened in the Soviet Union, well then, dot, dot, dot. I'm going to come back to that thing. What happened in the Soviet Union was the disintegration of one particular kind of creation of something called socialism. It was 150 years old, the movement of socialism, which in the Russian Revolution in 1917, the folks there, Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, and the others, tried to put into effect. They did pretty well what it was that socialists thought they ought to do. What was it? They basically understood socialism in a way that is now rapidly changing. Here's what they thought. Capitalism, in their view, was a society in which the enterprises, the factories, the stores, the offices, were owned and operated by individual private citizens. They were free enterprises, if you like, or private enterprises. And the way they interacted with one another, buying and selling, and the way they interacted with the public was by means of markets. They sold stuff in exchange for money. So the way we say that in economics is it was private ownership of the means of production and markets as the way of distributing the goods and services. Well, then what was socialism if that was capitalism? Well, the answer was clear. You take the enterprises away from the private owners and the government takes them over, more or less. And you stop distributing goods and services by means of exchange, buying and selling, markets, and instead you use government planning. You distribute by a plan rather than a market. Capitalism, private enterprise and markets, socialism, public enterprise and planning. So when the Soviets made their revolution, 1917, they basically decided, since they couldn't dare take all the private enterprises away from the private owners, would have meant that the revolution was over 4 or 5 minutes after it would have begun. Why? Because the vast majority of Russian people in that time were farmers, peasants. They desperately wanted that land, and the only way that revolution could happen and survive is if it gave the people the land, which it did. Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin agreed we're going to distribute the land to the peasant. Therefore, the truth of it is that the Soviet Union never abolished private property. On the contrary, the most important property it had, it gave to private owners. That's what the revolution did, and that's why the peasants supported it. Without that, the Soviets would never have survived the Civil War, the invasion by the West, and so on. But the Soviet Union did transfer industry from private to public hands. Not agriculture, which is where most people work, but industry. And they also developed a planning mechanism to distribute goods. They produced the socialism they understood was their task as socialist revolutionaries. 1917, with the rest of Eastern Europe coming after World War II, as you all know. Let's take a look for a few minutes at what that socialism achieved and what went wrong, because it'll help me situate for you what is happening now.